In a vast expanse of the galaxy, where war is constant and betrayal is a weapon, Ragnar Blaze, known as Mad Blaze, is a man shaped by fire. His squadron is devastated, his ship shattered, and his crew wiped out by the merciless Kha'Zari Empire. But when Ragnar crashes on the warworld of Zethra, he doesn't just survive, he fights back. Captured by Kalia, the ruthless princess of the Kha'Zari, Ragnar's defiance sparks a fire in her that neither of them can extinguish. Together, they defy fate, standing against an empire built on betrayal, while a greater war looms on the horizon. Will they survive the forces that seek to tear them apart? Or will their bond become the galaxy's greatest weapon? Don't miss the story of fire, fury, and an unlikely alliance. Hit that subscribe button now and join the battle for survival. The galaxy stretched out like an endless battlefield, stars blazing through the void in a dance of light and destruction. At its heart flew Ragnar Blaze, call sign Mad Blaze, a pilot whose name echoed through Earth's interstellar legion like a war cry. At 32, he was a man forged in fire, steel-gray eyes that burned with an unyielding intensity, a jaw set like stone beneath a week's worth of stubble, and a body lean and scarred from a decade of conflict. His ship, the Iron Fong, was an extension of him, sleek, battered, and roaring with power as he led his squadron against the Kha'Zari Empire, a race of alien warriors whose dominion spanned half the known stars. Their fleet loomed ahead, a swarm of obsidian warships cutting through space like shards of night, their hulls glinting with menace under the distant glow of a nebula. Blaze, break left. Lieutenant Teravas's voice crackled over the comms, sharp and urgent, cutting through the chaos of battle. Ragnar grinned beneath his helmet, a feral flash of teeth, and yanked the controls. The Iron Fong spun in a tight barrel roll, engines screaming as it dodged a salvo of energy lances that lit the void in blinding white. "Too slow, Voss," he rasped, his voice rough as gravel over the static. "Keep up or get burned." His fingers danced across the console, locking onto a Kha'Zari interceptor darting through the fray. A burst of ion rounds erupted from his cannons, slamming into the enemy ship's core. It exploded in a silent fireball, debris scattering like embers across the black, and Ragnar let out a low, triumphant laugh. "Show off," Voss muttered, but there was a grin in her tone. She banked her own ship, the Silver Claw, to cover his flank, her blonde hair visible through her cockpit's visor as she matched his pace. They'd flown together for years, her steady precision balancing his wild fury, and Ragnar trusted her like no one else. But trust was a rare commodity for him. 5 years ago, on Rigel 7, he'd learned that lesson the hard way. A mercenary gig gone sour, a double cross by a supposed ally, and his entire crew, brothers and sisters he'd bled with, left burning in a collapsing outpost. He'd crawled out alone, the only survivor, swearing never to lean on anyone again. That fire still smoldered in him, driving every move he made. The Kha'Zari weren't here to play games. A dreadnought pivoted in the distance, its massive frame dwarfing the interceptors, its main cannon humming with a deep, ominous glow that sent a chill down Ragnar's spine. He'd seen that glow before, Rigel 7, the moment before everything went to hell. "Incoming!" Voss shouted, her voice cutting through the comms, but it was too late. The dreadnought fired, a beam of raw energy tearing through space like a god's wrath. It struck the Iron Fong dead on, and the world erupted. Glass shattered, metal buckled, and alarms screamed as the ship spun out of control. Ragnar's hands gripped the controls, fighting to stabilize, but the damage was catastrophic. "Voss, get out of here!" he roared, but static swallowed his words as the Iron Fong broke apart, hurling him into the abyss. He fell, tumbling through the void, a meteor wrapped in flames, toward Zethra, the Kha'Zari's frontier warworld. The crash was deafening. The Iron Fong slammed into the crimson soil, carving a smoking trench 100 meters long, its wreckage hissing and popping as it settled. Pain seared through Ragnar's ribs, a jagged edge of the cockpit slicing a gash above his left brow. Blood trickled into his eye, warm and sticky, but he forced himself up, coughing against the sulfur-tinged air. His flight suit hung in tatters, exposing the lean, scarred muscle of a man who'd walked through hell too many times to count. In his right hand, he clutched a shard of the ship's hull. Sharp, glinting under Zethra's twin suns, a piece of his defiance he refused to let go. The sky burned red, the air thick and choking, but Ragnar stood, every breath a silent vow to keep fighting. Footsteps approached, heavy, deliberate, armored. From the haze of smoke and dust emerged a figure clad in shimmering armor, her presence commanding the silence that followed the crash. Kalia, princess of the Kha'Zari, stepped forward, flanked by two towering guards whose plasma spears crackled with faint blue energy. Her armor was a marvel, sleek and form-fitting. It hugged her battle-honed frame like a second skin, accentuating the strength of her shoulders, the curve of her hips, the power in her legs. Her face was sharp and regal, carved from war, with eyes that glowed red like twin embers in a forge. Her black hair cascaded down her back, a river of night untouched by the chaos around her, and when she spoke, her voice cut through the air like a blade dipped in frost. "So this is humanity," she said, her tone smooth and cold, laced with disdain as she gazed down at Ragnar. A weakling crawling from the ashes of defeat. Pathetic. Her guards shifted, their spears lowering slightly, ready to strike at her command. Ragnar didn't flinch. He straightened, though his legs trembled from the impact, and wiped the blood from his brow with the back of his hand. His steel-gray eyes locked onto hers, burning with a fire that matched, no, challenged, the red glow of her own. "Pathetic enough to make you show up, princess," he replied, his voice a low rasp, dripping with grit and a smirk that dared her to prove him wrong. A flicker across Kalia's face, surprise, perhaps, or the faintest shadow of intrigue, but it vanished as quickly as it came, buried beneath her regal mask. She'd seen countless enemies fall before her, pirates who'd raided her borders, rebels who defied her rule, rival clans who challenged her lineage. None had ever met her gaze like this, least of all a human, a species her people dismissed as vermin, fit only to be crushed underfoot. She gestured to her guards with a flick of her wrist. "Bind him," she ordered, her voice steady as steel. "This one's arrogance will amuse the council before we dispose of him." Energy cords snapped around Ragnar's wrists, buzzing with a faint, electric hum that sent a jolt through his arms. The guards yanked him forward, their strength unyielding, and he stumbled but didn't fall. As they dragged him toward a sleek transport hovering nearby, Ragnar's mind raced. That shard of metal pressed against his palm, hidden beneath the cords, a lifeline he'd clung to before. Rigel, Seven had taught him how to turn scraps into salvation, how to fight when the odds were stacked against him. He'd survived worse than this, and he'd survive now. The transport's engines hummed, lifting off with a low whine, carrying him deeper into the heart of the Kha'Zari Empire. Kalia watched him go, her posture rigid, her arms crossed over her chest. She told herself he was nothing, a fleeting annoyance, a bug to be squashed. Yet something lingered in her mind, unbidden and unwelcome. The memory of his defiant smirk, the way his eyes had burned into hers without a trace of fear. She'd crushed stronger foes, broken greater wills. But this human carried a spark she couldn't quite extinguish. She turned away, her boots clicking against the crimson soil, dismissing the unease that flickered in her chest. The transport vanished into the haze, and with it went Ragnar Blaze. A prisoner, yes, but a man whose fire had only just begun to burn. The transport hummed through the crimson haze of Zethra, its sleek hull cutting a path toward the Kha'Zari stronghold, a fortress of black stone and shimmering spires rising from the horizon like the jagged teeth of some ancient beast. Inside, Ragnar Blaze sat shackled, the energy cords around his wrists buzzing faintly, sending prickles of heat up his arms. His steel-gray eyes scanned the cramped hold, taking in the two guards who flanked him, towering figures in angular armor, their plasma spears held at the ready, faces hidden behind visors that glowed with a dull red light. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and sweat, but Ragnar's mind was sharp, turning over every detail like a predator sizing up its cage. In his palm, pressed tight against his skin, the jagged shard of the Iron Fang's hull remained hidden, a secret weapon, a sliver of hope he'd carried from the wreckage. He shifted slightly, testing the cords. They tightened in response, a low hum warning him against resistance. But Ragnar smirked to himself. He'd faced worse odds. Rigel. 7 had been a death trap, a burning outpost where he'd clawed his way out with nothing but a broken blade and a will to live. That day, he'd lost everything. His crew, his trust, his illusions. Now, captured by the Kha'Zari, he was alone again, but alone was where he thrived. The transport jolted as it descended, landing with a heavy thud, and the guards yanked him to his feet. "Move, human," one growled, voice distorted through his helmet. Ragnar complied, but his eyes never stopped searching for an exit, a weakness, anything. They dragged him into a cavernous chamber within the stronghold, its walls carved with swirling alien runes that pulsed with faint blue light. Chains hung from the ceiling, and a platform loomed ahead, flanked by more Kha'Zari warriors in gleaming armor. At its center stood Kalia, princess of this brutal empire, her presence as commanding as it had been on the crash site. Her red eyes fixed on Ragnar, cold and unyielding, though that flicker of intrigue from before lingered in their depths. She wore no helmet now, her black hair cascading freely over her shoulders, catching the light like polished obsidian. "Kneel," she ordered, her voice slicing through the silence. Ragnar didn't budge. "Not my style, princess," he replied, his tone low and defiant, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. The guard shoved him forward, forcing him to his knees, but he kept his head high, meeting her gaze. A murmur rippled through the warriors, shock, perhaps, or disdain, but Kalia raised a hand, silencing them. "Your kind is bold," she said, stepping closer, her boots clicking against the stone. "Bold and foolish. You'll learn your place soon enough." She turned to address the room, her voice rising. "This human is a specimen of their weakness, a trophy of our triumph. The council will decide his fate." Before she could finish, the chamber trembled. A low rumble grew into a deafening roar, and the far wall exploded inward, showering the room with debris. Shouts erupted as Kha'Zari warriors drew their weapons, plasma spears crackling to life. Through the breach stormed a wave of armored figures, Kha'Zari, but different, their armor scratched and patched, their movements chaotic yet purposeful. Rebels. Leading them was a hulking figure, nearly 3 meters tall, his armor adorned with jagged spikes and a crimson cape that billowed like blood in the wind. Zorak, the traitor general, his voice booming over the chaos. "The throne is mine, Kalia. Your reign ends here." Ragnar's instincts kicked in. As the guards turned to face the attackers, their grip on him slackened. He twisted his wrists, sliding the metal shard from his palm to the cords. It wasn't much, a jagged, finger-length piece of hull, but it was enough. He sawed at the energy bindings, the shard sparking as it cut through the humming strands. The cord snapped with a sharp crack, and Ragnar surged to his feet, adrenaline flooding his veins. A rebel charged at Kalia, blade raised, and without thinking, Ragnar lunged. He snatched a fallen spearhead from the floor, a broken piece of Kha'Zari tech, and hurled it with deadly precision. It struck the rebel's throat, blood spraying as he collapsed at Kalia's feet. She whirled, her red eyes wide with shock, locking onto Ragnar. "Why?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the din of battle. He stepped closer, brushing past the guard to stand at her side, his smirk returning. "Because I'd rather beat you myself than let some traitor do it," he said, his tone laced with challenge. Kalia's jaw tightened, but there was no time to argue. Zorak's rebels pressed forward, their numbers overwhelming, and the stronghold's defenders faltered. "We need to move," Ragnar said, nodding toward a side passage half hidden by rubble. Kalia hesitated, her pride warring with necessity, then gave a curt nod. "Follow me," she snapped, and they ran. The passage led them out of the stronghold and into the wilds of Zethra, a jungle of glowing flora, where trees pulsed with neon veins and the air hung heavy with moisture and the scent of decay. Ragnar kept pace with Kalia, his boots sinking into the soft, crimson soil, his senses alert to every rustle and snap. Behind them, the sounds of battle faded, replaced by the eerie hum of the jungle. Kalia stopped abruptly, turning to face him, her plasma sword drawn and glowing faintly in the dim light. "Don't think this changes anything, human," she said, her voice low and edged with suspicion. "You're still my prisoner." Ragnar raised his hands, the freed wrists still red from the cords, and chuckled, a rough, gravelly sound that echoed through the trees. "Sure, princess, but right now, your prisoner's the only thing keeping you alive." He held up the metal shard, twirling it between his fingers, its edges glinting in the neon glow. Kalia's eyes narrowed, but she didn't strike. She'd seen rebels fall by her blade, crushed empires under her command, but this human, this Ragnar Blaze, was something else. He'd cut his bond with a scrap of junk, killed a man to save her, and now stood there smirking like he owned the damn planet. "We can't stay here," she said finally, sheathing her sword with a sharp click. "Zorak's forces will hunt us. The jungle's our best chance." Ragnar nodded, falling in a step beside her as they plunged deeper into the undergrowth. The trees closed in, their glowing branches casting strange shadows across their path, and the air grew thicker, pressing against their lungs. Kalia moved with the grace of a predator, her armor barely making a sound. But Ragnar matched her stride, his torn flight suit a stark contrast to her gleaming plating. He was battered, bleeding, but unbowed, a man who'd walked through fire before and come out stronger. Hours passed, the twin suns of Zethra dipping lower, painting the jungle in shades of blood and shadow. They found shelter in a shallow cave, its entrance half hidden by vines that pulsed with faint light. Kalia leaned against the wall, her red eyes scanning the darkness outside, while Ragnar crouched near the entrance, his shard still in hand. The silence between them was heavy, thick with unspoken questions. "You didn't have to save me," she said at last, her voice softer now, though still edged with steel. "Why risk it?" Ragnar glanced at her, his gray eyes catching the glow of the vines. "Maybe I just hate losing," he said, his smirk fading into something harder, something haunted. Rigel, 7 flashed through his mind. The screams of his crew, the heat of the flames, the weight of being the only one left. He'd sworn to fight alone, but here he was, tethered to this alien princess by a twist of fate. "Or maybe," he added, voice dropping low, "I figured you're worth more alive than dead." Kalia studied him, her gaze piercing through the dimness. She didn't trust him, couldn't trust him, not after a lifetime of war and betrayal. Zorak had been her father's closest ally once, before ambition turned him into an enemy. And yet, this human had acted when her own guards had faltered. "You're a fool," she said, turning away, but her words lacked their earlier bite. Ragnar chuckled again, settling back against the cave wall, the shard resting in his lap. "Maybe," he said, "but I'm a fool who's still breathing." Outside, the jungle stirred, a distant roar, a rustle of leaves. Ragnar's hand tightened on the shard, and Kalia's fingers brushed the hilt of her sword. They were enemies, bound by necessity, but for now, they shared the same fight. As night fell over Zethra, Ragnar struck the shard against a stone, sparking a small fire to light the cave. The flames danced, casting shadows across Kalia's face, and for a moment she watched them flicker, watched him, and wondered what kind of man could turn ashes into defiance. The jungle of Zethra stretched out like a living labyrinth, its glowing canopy a kaleidoscope of neon blues and greens that pulsed faintly in the darkness. Ragnar Blaze crouched near the cave's entrance, The small fire he'd sparked with his metal shard, casting flickering shadows across the damp stone walls. The flames were meager, barely enough to warm his hands, but they held the night at bay, a fragile shield against the unknown lurking beyond. Across from him, Kalia leaned against the wall, her red eyes glinting in the firelight, her armored form tense and watchful. Her plasma sword rested across her knees, its hilt within easy reach, a silent reminder of the uneasy truce between them. Outside, the jungle stirred. A low, guttural roar echoed through the trees, followed by the rustle of leaves and the snap of branches. Ragnar's grip tightened on the shard, his senses honed from years of fighting. First as a mercenary, then as a pilot. He'd heard sounds like that before, on worlds where survival meant staying one step ahead of death. Kalia shifted, her head tilting slightly as she listened. "Kravoks," she said, her voice low and steady. "Pack hunters. They'll smell your blood soon enough, human." She glanced at the cut above his brow, still oozing from the crash, and her lips pressed into a thin line. "Then we'd better move," Ragnar replied, standing with a grunt. His ribs ached, his flight suit hung in tatters, but he pushed the pain aside. "Unless you'd rather sit here and play bait, princess." Kalia's eyes narrowed, but she rose without a word, sheathing her sword with a sharp click. They stepped out into the jungle, the air thick with moisture and the electric hum of unseen life. The twin suns had vanished below the horizon, leaving only the eerie glow of the flora to guide them, a world alive with beauty and danger in equal measure. The first attack came without warning. A shadow lunged from the undergrowth, a blur of claws and teeth, its scales shimmering like oil in the neon light. Ragnar reacted on instinct, shoving Kalia aside and swinging the metal shard. It caught the Kravoks across the jaw, drawing a spray of dark blood, but the creature snarled and lunged again. Kalia rolled to her feet, her sword igniting with a hiss of plasma. She slashed upward, cleaving the beast in two, its halves collapsing in a steaming heap. "Stay behind me," she snapped, her tone sharp with command. Ragnar smirked, wiping the blood from his shard. "Nice swing, but I'm not your damsel." Before she could retort, another Kravoks burst through the vines, its jaws snapping inches from his throat. He ducked, driving the shard into its eye with a wet crunch. The creature howled, thrashing wildly, and Ragnar yanked the shard free, finishing it with a stab to the neck. He straightened, breathing hard, and met Kalia's gaze. For a moment, she said nothing, her red eyes studying him, his blood-streaked hands, his unflinching stance. Then she nodded, a grudging acknowledgement, and turned back to the path. They pressed on, the jungle growing denser, its glowing branches weaving a ceiling that trapped the heat below. Sweat beaded on Ragnar's brow, mixing with the blood from his cut, but he kept moving, his boots sinking into the soft, crimson soil. Kalia led the way, her movements fluid and precise, a warrior born to this world. Yet her glances back at Ragnar grew more frequent, her suspicions softening into something else, curiosity, perhaps, or the faintest trace of respect. He'd save her once, fought beside her now, and each act chipped away at the wall she'd built between them. Hours bled into exhaustion, and the jungle's threats multiplied. A sudden storm erupted, rain falling in sheets of glowing liquid that hissed against the leaves. The ground turned to mud, sucking at their feet, and the air crackled with static as lightning split the sky. "We need shelter," Ragnar shouted over the roar, shielding his eyes from the deluge. Kalia pointed ahead, her voice barely audible. "There, a ridge." They stumbled toward it, finding a shallow overhang beneath a cliff of black rock, its surface slick with moss that glowed faintly blue. They ducked inside, the rain pounding a curtain across the entrance, sealing them in a pocket of stillness. Ragnar shook water from his hair, his torn suit clinging to his frame, and sank against the wall with a groan. Kalia stood near the edge, her armor glistening wet, her red eyes scanning the storm. "This won't hold long," she said, her tone clipped. The Kravoks hunt in packs, and the rain will bring worse. Ragnar pulled the shard from his belt, twirling it between his fingers. Then we'll be ready, he said, his voice steady despite the ache in his bones. Silence settled between them, broken only by the drum of rain and the distant rumble of thunder. Kalia turned, her gaze lingering on Ragnar, his broad shoulders, the scars visible through the rips in his suit, the fire that still burned in his gray eyes despite everything. She'd seen warriors break under less, yet here he was, a human defying the odds on her world. You fight well, she said at last, her words careful, testing. For one of your kind. Ragnar chuckled, a rough sound that echoed in the small space. Thanks, princess. I'll take that as a compliment. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and met her stare. You're not so bad yourself. That sword's got some bite. Kalia's lips twitched. Not quite a smile, but close, and she sat across from him, her posture loosening for the first time. It served me well, she said, her fingers brushing the hilt. My father forged it before. She stopped, her expression hardening, and Ragnar tilted his head. Before what? He pressed, his tone softer now, probing. Kalia's eyes flicked to the firelight, then back to him. Before Zorak betrayed him, she said, her voice tight. He was my father's general, his right hand. When he turned, he took half the empire with him. The words hung heavy, a wound she rarely spoke aloud, and Ragnar nodded slowly. He knew betrayal. Rigel, 7 had carved that lesson into his soul. Sounds like we got something in common, he said, his voice low. I lost my crew to a knife in the back. Only difference is I walked away. Kalia studied him, her red eyes searching his face. And yet you saved me, she said, her tone almost a challenge. Why? Ragnar leaned back, the shard glinting as he turned it in his hand. Maybe I'm tired of losing, he said, his smirk fading into something raw. Or maybe I see something worth fighting for. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning neither dared to unpack, and Kalia looked away, her breath catching slightly. The storm raged on, but within the overhang, a quiet warmth grew. Ragnar struck the shard against the stone again, coaxing a small fire to life with a handful of dry moss he'd scavenged. The flames danced, casting a golden glow across Kalia's armor, softening the harsh lines of her face. She watched him work, her fingers brushing the edge of her sword, and for a moment, their hands nearly touched as he adjusted the fire. The air thickened, charged with something unspoken, tension, curiosity, a spark neither could name. Kalia pulled back first, her voice firm but quieter. Rest, human. We'll need it. Ragnar nodded, settling against the rock, but his eyes lingered on her. She was a warrior, a princess, an enemy. Yet here, in the glow of his fire, she was something more. He thought of Rigel, 7, the ashes he'd left behind, and wondered if this time the fire might burn a different path. Outside, the rain slowed, and a new sound rose, a low, rhythmic thrum like footsteps in the mud. Kalia's hand tightened on her sword, and Ragnar gripped his shard. The jungle wasn't done with him yet, and whatever came next, they'd face it together, for now. The rhythmic thrum grew louder, vibrating through the muddy ground beneath the overhang where Ragnar Blaze and Kalia sheltered. Rain dripped from the glowing vines outside, a steady hiss that masked the jungle's usual chorus, but couldn't drown out that sound, a deep, mechanical pulse that set Ragnar's teeth on edge. He gripped his metal shard, its edges worn but still sharp, and glanced at Kalia. Her red eyes narrowed, her armored frame tense as she rose, plasma sword in hand. That's no Kravoks, she said, her voice low and urgent. It's coming from the east, Zorak's territory. Ragnar stood, brushing mud from his torn flight suit, his ribs protesting with every move. Sounds like trouble, he said, his tone grim but steady. What's he got out there? Kalia's jaw tightened, her gaze flicking to the horizon where the thrum pulsed like a heartbeat. The Dark Core, she replied, the words heavy with dread. A weapon my father banned, unstable, forbidden. If Zorax activated it, he could wipe out Zethra and beyond. Ragnar's eyes darkened. Beyond Mint Earth, his home, however distant it felt now. Then we stop it, he said, stepping out into the fading rain. Lead the way, princess. Kalia hesitated, her pride warring with the reality of their situation. She was a Kha'Zari princess, bred for command, yet here she was, reliant on this battered human who defied her at every turn. But his fire, his relentless, infuriating fire, had kept them alive this far. She nodded, a sharp jerk of her head, and they plunged back into the jungle, the thrum guiding them like a beacon through the neon-lit undergrowth. The journey was brutal. The storm had churned the jungle into a mire, roots snagging their boots, branches clawing at their skin. Ragnar's shard proved its worth again, slicing through vines that blocked their path, while Kalia's sword carved a trail when the growth grew too thick. Hours bled into a relentless march, the thrum growing louder until it rattled their bones. They crested a ridge, and there it was, a rebel outpost nestled in a crater, its black spires jagged against the crimson sky. At its center loomed a massive device, a sphere of dark metal pulsing with veins of violet energy, its surface crackling with static. The dark core. Guards, Kalia whispered, pointing to the perimeter where Kha'Zari rebels patrolled, their armor patched and weapons glowing. Ragnar crouched beside her, his gray eyes scanning the layout. 10, maybe 12, he muttered. Too many to fight head-on. He glanced at the shard in his hand, then at the outpost's power conduits, exposed pipes running from the core to a generator humming nearby. We don't need to fight, he said, a smirk tugging at his lips. We just need to break it. Kalia raised an eyebrow, her red eyes skeptical. You have a plan? She asked, her tone laced with doubt. Ragnar's smirk widened. Always do, princess. Follow my lead. He slipped down the ridge, moving low and fast, Kalia close behind. They reached the edge of the crater, hiding behind a stack of crates as a guard passed. Ragnar pried open a crate, revealing vials of glowing liquid, some kind of fuel, volatile by the look of it. Perfect, he said, grabbing two and tucking them into his belt. Ever made a bomb, Kalia? She stared at him, incredulous. You're insane, she hissed, but there was a flicker of admiration in her eyes. Ragnar chuckled, a rough sound that sent a shiver through her despite herself. Insane's how I survive, he said, nodding toward the generator. Get me there. I'll handle the rest. Kalia exhaled sharply, then darted out, her sword igniting as she cut down a guard before he could raise the alarm. Ragnar followed, his shard slashing another's throat in a swift, silent kill. They moved as a unit, her precision matching his raw instinct, and reached the generator in moments. Ragnar worked fast, cracking the vials and pouring their contents into a makeshift casing, a hollowed-out canister he'd scavenged. He wedged the shard into the mix, its edges sparking as he twisted it to ignite the fuel. Fire's my specialty, he muttered, glancing at Kalia. She covered him, her sword flashing as two more guards charged. She parried one, slicing through his armor, then spun to impale the other, her movements a deadly dance. Hurry, she snapped, blood dripping from her blade. Ragnar struck the shard against the canister's rim. A spark flared, then a flame, and he hurled it at the generator. The explosion was deafening. Fire roared outward, engulfing the generator in a ball of orange and violet, sending shrapnel flying. The dark core's pulse faltered, its energy veins flickering as alarms blared across the outpost. Rebels swarmed, shouting orders, but Ragnar and Kalia were already moving, racing toward the core itself. Inside, Ragnar yelled, spotting a maintenance hatch. Kalia kicked it open, and they tumbled into a narrow tunnel, the walls humming with the weapon's power. The air inside was thick with static, the violet glow bathing them in an eerie light. Ragnar led the way, his shard cutting through wires that sparked and hissed, while Kalia followed, her sword ready. They reached the core's heart, a chamber where the sphere loomed, its surface pulsing faster, dangerously unstable. "We need to overload it," Kalia said, her voice tight. Ragnar nodded, spotting a control panel. He smashed it open with the shard, exposing a tangle of circuits. "Human trick," he said, ripping out a handful and twisting them together. Sparks flew, the core's hum rising to a scream, and Kalia grabbed his arm. "Run!" They sprinted back through the tunnel as the chamber shook, the core's energy spiraling out of control. They burst out into the crater just as the outpost erupted behind them, a shockwave of fire and light flattening everything in its path. Ragnar tackled Kalia to the ground, shielding her as debris rained down, the heat searing their skin. When the dust settled, the core was gone, reduced to a smoking ruin, its threat extinguished. They lay there, breathless, Ragnar's weight pinning her to the mud, their faces inches apart. Kalia's red eyes locked onto his, her chest rising and falling beneath her armor. "You did it," she said, her voice a mix of disbelief and something softer. Ragnar grinned, his blood-streaked face hovering over hers. "We did it," he corrected, his breath warm against her skin. The adrenaline still coursed through them, a wildfire neither could tame, and Kalia's hand gripped his arm, her fingers digging in. "You're impossible," she whispered, but her tone was raw, unguarded. They stumbled to their feet, retreating to a nearby wreck, a Kha'Zari scout ship, abandoned in the chaos. Inside, the cockpit was dim, lit only by the faint glow of cracked screens, but it offered shelter. Ragnar sank against the wall, his body screaming with exhaustion, while Kalia stood near the console, her armor scratched and dented. The silence was heavy, charged with the echoes of their victory, and something more. She turned, stepping closer, her red eyes searching his. "Why do you fight like that?" she asked, her voice low, almost vulnerable. No fear, no hesitation. Ragnar looked up, his gray eyes steady. "Because I've got nothing left to lose," he said, his tone rough but honest. "Rigel, Seven took everything, my crew, my faith. All I've got is this." He held up the shard, its edges glinting, then let it drop. "And maybe you." The words slipped out, unbidden, and Kalia froze, her breath catching. She'd lost too. Her father, her empire's unity, to Zorak's betrayal. For a moment, they were mirrors, reflecting scars neither had spoken aloud. Kalia stepped closer, her armor clinking softly, and knelt before him. Her hand brushed his chest, tentative, feeling the heat of his skin through the torn suit. "You're a fire I can't extinguish," she said, her voice trembling with something fierce. Ragnar reached up, his fingers tracing the edge of her jaw, rough against her smooth, alien skin. "Good," he rasped, pulling her down. Their lips met, a clash of heat and need, her coolness against his warmth, a storm breaking after days of tension. She straddled him, her armor pressing into his chest, and they sank into the shadows of the wreck, hands roaming, breaths mingling in a desperate, wordless dance. The world faded, leaving only the fire they'd ignited, raw, untamed, unstoppable. When they parted, gasping, the wreck's silence enveloped them. Kalia rested her forehead against his, her red eyes soft for the first time. "We're not done," she said, her voice a vow. "Zorak's still out there." Ragnar nodded, his hand lingering on her waist. "Then we finish him," he said, his grin returning. Together, they rose, battered but unbroken, the shard back in his hand, the fire between them burning brighter than ever. The wreckage of the scout ship creaked around Ragnar Blaze and Kalia as they emerged from its shadowed embrace, the air still thick with the heat of their victory and the fire of their connection. Dawn broke over Zethra, the twin suns casting a blood-red glow across the smoldering ruins of the rebel outpost. The dark core was gone, its violet energy extinguished in the explosion Ragnar had engineered, but the silence that followed was deceptive. Zorak, the traitor general, had survived, and the rhythmic thud of boots on crimson soil echoed through the jungle. a war party coming to finish what the core could not. Ragnar adjusted his grip on the metal shard, its edges dulled from use, but still lethal in his scarred hands. His flight suit hung in tatters, blood and mud caking his lean frame, but his steel-gray eyes burned with a relentless fire. Beside him, Kalia stood tall, her armor scratched and dented, her plasma sword glowing faintly at her side. Her red eyes met his, a flicker of something fierce and unspoken passing between them. Trust, forged in the crucible of battle and the wreck's intimacy. "He'll come for us," she said, her voice steady but laced with resolve. "Zorak won't stop until I'm dead. Or he is. Then we make sure it's him," Ragnar replied, his tone rough but certain. He stepped closer, his hand brushing her arm. A fleeting touch, but enough to ground them both. "You ready, princess?" Kalia's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "Always human," she said, and they turned as one, moving toward the sound of their enemy. The jungle parted like a curtain, revealing Zorak and his rebels. A force of 20, their armor patched and weapons crackling with plasma. Zorak towered at their head, a giant even among Kha'Zari, his spiked armor glinting in the dawn light, his crimson cape billowing like a banner of war. His face was a mask of scars, one eye replaced by a glowing red implant, and his voice boomed across the clearing. "Kalia!" he roared, raising a massive energy axe. "Your father's legacy ends here. And you, human, your kind is a plague I'll burn out." Ragnar smirked, stepping forward beside Kalia. "Big words for a guy who hides behind a toy," he said, nodding at the axe. "Come try it." Zorak's eye flared, and he charged, the rebels fanning out behind him. Kalia ignited her sword, meeting his axe in a shower of sparks, the clash ringing through the trees. Ragnar dove into the fray, his shard slashing a rebel's throat before the man could fire. Blood sprayed, and he rolled, snatching a fallen plasma pistol from the mud. He fired, taking down another, his movements a blur of instinct and fury. The battle was chaos. Kalia and Zorak traded blows, her speed against his brute strength, each strike shaking the ground. Ragnar weaved through the rebels, the pistol barking in his hand, the shard a deadly extension of his will. He fought like a man possessed, every move a testament to the fire that had carried him through Rigel, 7 and beyond. But the numbers were against them. A rebel's spear grazed his thigh, tearing flesh, and Ragnar stumbled, blood pooling beneath him. Kalia saw it, her red eyes widening, and she faltered, Zorak's axe slashing down toward her. "No!" Ragnar roared, lunging despite the pain. He threw the shard with all his strength, and it struck Zorak's wrist, lodging deep. The general bellowed, his axe dropping, and Kalia seized the moment, driving her sword through his shoulder. Zorak staggered, but he wasn't done. He swung a massive fist, catching Kalia across the chest and sending her crashing into a tree. She hit hard, her armor cracking, and slumped to the ground, dazed. Ragnar's vision blurred with rage. He charged, tackling Zorak with a force that belied his human frame. They grappled in the mud, Zorak's strength overwhelming. But Ragnar fought dirty, clawing, biting, slamming his knee into the general's gut. "You don't touch her," he snarled, wrenching the shard free from Zorak's wrist and driving it toward his throat. Zorak caught his arm, twisting until Ragnar's bones creaked, and flung him aside. He landed hard, the air knocked from his lungs, the shard skittering across the ground. Zorak loomed over him, raising his axe with one good arm. "Pathetic human," he spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're nothing." But before the blow could fall, Kalia surged to her feet, blood streaming from a cut on her temple. She threw herself at Zorak, her sword slashing across his back. He roared, turning to face her, and Ragnar saw his chance. He scrambled for the shard, his fingers closing around it, and leapt onto Zorak's back. With a primal yell, he drove the shard into the general's neck, twisting until blood gushed hot and dark. Zorak's roar became a gurgle, his massive frame shuddering as he fell to his knees. Kalia stepped forward, her sword raised, and with a final, decisive thrust, she pierced his chest. The light in his implant flickered out, and he collapsed, a mountain brought low by a human and a princess united. The remaining rebels froze, their weapons lowering as their leader's blood soaked the earth. Silence fell, broken only by the ragged breathing of Ragnar and Kalia. She dropped to one knee beside him, her hand gripping his shoulder. "You're hurt," she said, her voice tight with concern, her red eyes scanning his bloodied thigh. Ragnar grinned through the pain, his hand covering hers. "Worth it," he rasped, his gaze steady. "You okay, princess?" Kalia nodded, her fingers tightening on him, and for a moment they stayed there, two warriors battered but unbroken, their bonds sealed in the heat of battle. The jungle stirred again, but this time it wasn't rebels. Figures emerged from the trees, Kha'Zari civilians, their armor patched and faces weary, drawn by the explosion of the dark core and the sounds of fighting. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, staring at the fallen Zorak, then at Ragnar and Kalia. A murmur rippled through them, growing into a cheer, a raw, defiant roar of hope. An elder stepped forward, his gray hair braided with beads, his voice trembling with awe. "You've slain the traitor," he said, bowing to Kalia. "And you, human, you've fought for us." Ragnar pulled himself up, leaning on Kalia as she steadied him. "Didn't have much choice," he said, his smirk returning, though his eyes softened as they met hers. Kalia straightened, her armor glinting in the dawn light, and faced her people. "Zorak's reign is over," she declared, her voice ringing clear. "But the fight isn't. Will you stand with us?" The civilians raised their fists, their cheers swelling, and Ragnar felt a flicker of something he hadn't known since Rigel. 7. Pride, not just for himself, but for what they'd built together. She turned to him, her red eyes fierce and unguarded. "You're more than I thought," she said, her voice low, meant only for him. Ragnar's hand slid to her waist, a quiet promise in his touch. "And you're everything I didn't expect," he replied, his tone rough but warm. The crowd pressed closer, offering aid, but Kalia waved them off, her focus on Ragnar. "We need to regroup," she said, her pragmatism returning. "The council will demand answers." "Let him try," Ragnar said, his grin widening. "We've got fire they can't put out." Kalia's lips curved, a rare, fleeting smile, and she helped him limp toward the civilians, their steps synchronized despite the wounds. Zorak was dead, but the war wasn't over. The shard lay forgotten in the mud, its purpose served, but the fire between Ragnar and Kalia burned brighter than ever, a flame that would carry them into the battles ahead. The crimson dawn lingered over Zethra, its twin suns casting long shadows across the jungle clearing where Ragnar Blaze and Kalia stood amidst the cheering Kha'Zari civilians. Zorak's body lay still in the mud, his crimson cape soaked dark with blood, a testament to the victory they'd clawed from the jaws of defeat. Ragnar leaned heavily on Kalia, his thigh wound seeping through a makeshift bandage, his torn flight suit barely clinging to his scarred frame. Yet his steel-gray eyes burned with a fire undimmed, meeting the gazes of the crowd with a quiet, unshakable pride. Kalia's armor gleamed in the light, dented and scratched, but her posture was regal, her red eyes fierce as she faced her people, a princess reborn in battle. The elder who'd spoken before stepped closer, his braided hair swaying as he knelt, his voice thick with reverence. "You've given us hope, Princess Kalia," he said, glancing at Ragnar. "And you, human, you've shown us strength we didn't know existed." The crowd murmured agreement, fists raised in solidarity, their cheers a raw, defiant roar that echoed through the trees. Kalia's hand tightened on Ragnar's arm, steadying him, and she nodded. "We fought as one," she said, her voice ringing clear, "and we'll rebuild as one. But first, we return to the stronghold." The civilians parted, offering crude stretchers and salvage supplies, their eyes alight with a newfound faith. Ragnar limped forward, Kalia at his side, their steps synchronized despite the pain. The journey back was slow, the jungle's neon glow fading as they approached the black spires of the Kha'Zari stronghold. Smoke still curled from the breached walls, a scar left by Zorak's rebellion. But the fortress stood, a symbol of resilience, much like the two who now entered its gates. Inside, the chamber where Ragnar had been brought as a prisoner days ago was transformed. The council awaited, 6 stern figures in ornate armor seated on a raised dais, their faces etched with suspicion and fatigue. At their head sat Vrothar, an elder with silver-streaked hair and a voice like grinding stone. "Princess Kalia," he began, his tone cold. "You returned victorious, yet tainted. This human," he gestured to Ragnar, "is an outsider, a threat. The throne demands purity, not alliance with vermin." Kalia stepped forward, her chin high, her red eyes blazing. "Zorak was the threat," she countered, her voice sharp. "He nearly destroyed us all with the Dark Core. Ragnar stopped him, fought beside me when your guards fell. He's no vermin, he's a warrior." The council murmured, unconvinced, and Vrothar's gaze hardened. "Your father's bloodline is sacred," he said. "Consorting with this creature jeopardizes it. Renounce him, or renounce your claim." The words struck like a blade, and Kalia faltered, her breath catching. She'd been raised for this, groomed to lead, to uphold the Kha'Zari legacy. Her father's death, Zorak's betrayal, the weight of an empire fracturing under rebellion. It all pressed down on her, a duty she'd never questioned. Until now. She glanced at Ragnar, standing beside her, his bloodied frame unbowed, his gray eyes locked on hers with a quiet intensity that made her heart stutter. He'd saved her, fought for her, burned through every barrier she'd built. Could she cast that aside? Ragnar saw the conflict in her eyes, the storm raging beneath her regal mask. He stepped closer, his voice low, meant only for her. "You don't need me to win this, Kalia," he said, his tone rough but steady. "You're stronger than they know. But I'm not walking away. Not unless you tell me to." His hand brushed hers, a fleeting warmth, and Kalia's resolve wavered. She thought of the jungle, the fire he'd sparked to keep them alive, the wreck where their lips had met. A fire she couldn't extinguish, didn't want to. The chamber doors burst open, interrupting the tension. The civilians from the clearing flooded in, their voices rising in a cacophony of support. The elder led them, his staff striking the stone floor. "We saw them fight," he shouted, his words cutting through the council's murmurs. "The human and our princess, they slew Zorak, saved us from the core. If she chooses him, we choose them." The crowd roared, fists pounding the air, their faith a tide that drowned Vrothar's objections. Kalia turned to Ragnar, her red eyes searching his face, and in that moment, the choice crystallized. She stepped back, addressing the council with a voice that trembled with conviction. "My father taught me strength," she said, "but Ragnar taught me something more, courage beyond blood, unity beyond borders. I won't renounce him, because he's not my weakness. He's my fire." She reached for Ragnar's hand, her fingers intertwining with his, and the council recoiled, but the civilians cheered louder, their support unshakable. Vrothar rose, his face a mask of fury. "You defy tradition," he spat. "The throne will fall." But Ragnar stepped forward, his limp barely slowing him, his voice a low growl that silenced the room. "Tradition didn't stop Zorak," he said. "It didn't save your people. We did, and we're not done. You want to fight? You'll get one. Out there, where it matters." He pointed beyond the walls, to the galaxy waiting, and the council faltered, their authority crumbling under the weight of the crowd's will. Kalia squeezed his hand, her red eyes softening as she faced him. "You're a fool," she said, her tone warm, almost tender. "A glorious fool." Ragnar grinned, his scarred face lighting up. "Takes one to know one, princess," he replied, pulling her closer. The council's protests faded as they retreated, outmatched by the tide of change. The civilians surged forward, offering weapons, pledging loyalty, and Kalia, led Ragnar to a side chamber, a crystal-walled sanctuary where the sun's light refracted into 1,000 colors. Alone at last, she turned to him, her armor clinking as she closed the distance. "I chose you," she said, her voice breaking with emotion, "over everything I was raised to be." Ragnar cupped her face, his rough hands gentle against her smooth, alien skin. "And I'd burn the stars for you," he rasped, his gray eyes fierce. She pulled him into a kiss, deep, desperate, a collision of heat and need that echoed their first in the wreck, but richer now, layered with trust and promise. Her hands slid beneath his torn suit, tracing the scars of his past, while his fingers tangled in her black hair, anchoring her to him. They sank to the floor, the crystal walls shimmering around them, their breaths mingling in the quiet. Kalia's armor pressed against his chest, a barrier they didn't bother to shed. Not yet, but the closeness was enough, a vow sealed in touch and silence. When they parted, she rested her forehead against his, her red eyes glistening. "The galaxy won't forgive us," she whispered. Ragnar chuckled, his hand on her waist. "Good," he said. "Let's try to stop us." Footsteps approached, civilians, now soldiers bearing news. "A fleet gathers beyond the system," the elder said, his voice urgent. "Zorak's allies, or worse." Kalia rose, pulling Ragnar with her, their hands still linked. "Then we meet them," she said, her tone resolute. "Together." Ragnar nodded, his grin sharp and ready. The council could stew, the galaxy could rage, but they'd face it as one, a human and a Kha'Zari princess, their fire a beacon for what was to come. The crystal chamber's glow faded behind Ragnar Blaze and Kalia as they stepped into the stronghold's command hall, the air buzzing with urgency. The Kha'Zari civilians, now soldiers, parted to let them pass, their patched armor and salvaged weapons a testament to the rebellion they'd survived. The elder from the jungle stood at a holographic console, his braided hair swaying as he gestured to a flickering star map. "They're coming," he said, his voice taut. "A fleet, Zorak's remnants, or something darker. They've breached the outer system." The map pulsed red, dozens of blips converging on Zethra's orbit, a storm of steel and fire. Ragnar limped to the console, his thigh wound bandaged but still raw, his torn flight suit replaced with a Kha'Zari tunic, black and fitted, a stark contrast to his scarred, human frame. His steel-gray eyes narrowed at the map, calculating. "Numbers?" he asked, his tone rough but steady. The elder tapped the console, zooming in. 50 ships, maybe more," he replied. "Warships, heavy cannons. We've got half that, and most are damaged from Zorak's attack." Kalia joined them, her armor repaired, her red eyes blazing with resolve. "Then we make every shot count," she said, her voice a blade cutting through doubt. "We fight as one." The hall erupted into action, civilians turned soldiers rushing to stations, their faith in Kalia and Ragnar a fire that burned away fear. Ragnar glanced at her, a smirk tugging at his lips. "You sure about this, princess?" he asked, his hand brushing hers. She met his gaze, her fingers curling around his briefly. "With you?" "Always," she replied, and the warmth in her tone steadied him more than any armor could. They moved to the hangar, where the Kha'Zari fleet waited, sleek fighters and battered frigates, patched together but bristling with defiance. Ragnar took the helm of the command ship, the Star Fawn, its controls alien but familiar enough for a pilot who'd flown through hell. Kalia stood beside him, her presence an anchor as she relayed orders through a comm link, her voice ringing across the fleet. "Form up," she commanded. "We hold the line here, or Zethra falls, and Earth with it." The ships lifted off, engines roaring, and Ragnar felt a surge of adrenaline. The same fire that had carried him through Rigel 7, through the crash on Zethra, through every fight since. This time, though, he wasn't alone. The enemy fleet emerged from the void like a swarm of locusts, black-hulled warships, their cannons glowing with violet energy, remnants of Zorak's allies fused with something colder, more mechanical. "Agnasku twisted." "Drones," he muttered, recognizing the precision in their movements. Someone's pulling strings beyond Zethra. Kalia's jaw tightened. Then we cut them, she said, and Ragnar grinned. My kind of plan. The battle erupted in a blaze of light. Plasma bolts streaked across space, ships weaving through the chaos as explosions lit the darkness. Ragnar piloted the Starfang with a reckless grace, dodging a salvo that turned a nearby frigate to ash. Gunners, focus the lead ship, he barked, banking hard to expose the enemy's flank. Kalia relayed the order, and a barrage of ion rounds slammed into the drone flagship, cracking its hull. It retaliated, a beam of energy grazing the Starfang's shields, rocking the bridge. Ragnar held steady, his hands dancing over the controls, a pilot born for this. The Kha'Zari fought with ferocity, their patched ships outmatched but unrelenting, inspired by the human at their helm. Ragnar saw an opening, a cluster of drones powering a massive cannon, aimed at Zethra's surface. They're targeting the stronghold, he said, his voice grim. Kalia's eyes widened, then hardened. We stop it, she said, gripping his shoulder. Ragnar nodded, pushing the Starfang into a dive, weaving through enemy fire. All ships, cover us, he roared, and the fleet rallied, their cannons blazing a path. He flew straight for the cannon, shields sparking as hits landed, and Kalia manned the secondary guns, her shots precise and deadly. Almost there, she said, her voice tight. Ragnar smirked, flipping a switch he'd jury-rigged, a human touch on alien tech. Hold on, he warned, and slammed the throttle. The Starfang surged, ramming the cannon's core, its shields flaring as metal screeched. The impact triggered Ragnar's tweak, a surge of plasma from the engines, igniting the cannon's power cells. A fireball erupted, swallowing the cluster, and the Starfang spun free, its hull scorched but intact. The enemy faltered, their coordination breaking without the cannon, and the Kha'Zari pressed the advantage. Ship after ship fell, the drones scattering under the onslaught of a united front. Ragnar and Kalia stood at the helm, their hands brushing as they watched the tide turn, the fire of their defiance burning through the void. The last enemy ship exploded in a silent bloom of light, and silence fell, a victory hard won, etched in the stars. The fleet returned to Zethra, cheers echoing through the Starfang's comms as they landed. Ragnar stepped onto the hangar deck, his limp more pronounced, but his head high. Kalia followed, her armor glinting, her red eyes soft with pride. The civilians, now a militia, gathered, their voices rising in a chant. Blaze! Kalia! The elder approached, bowing low. You've forged a legend, he said, his tone awed. A human and our princess, together, unbeatable. Ragnar glanced at Kalia, his smirk softening into a rare, genuine smile. Couldn't have done it without her, he said, his voice rough but warm. Kalia's hand found his, her fingers threading through his. Nor I without you, she replied, and the crowd's cheers swelled, a tide of hope washing over the battered world. They moved to the command deck, the star map now clear, but Ragnar's gaze lingered on the horizon, on the galaxy beyond, where shadows still stirred. Later, in a private chamber overlooking Zethra's jungles, they stood alone. The room was simple, stone walls, a wide viewport, the twin suns sinking into dusk. Ragnar shed the tunic, his scars bared in the fading light, while Kalia removed her armor, piece by piece, revealing the lithe, battle-honed form beneath. She stepped closer, her black hair spilling over her shoulders, her red eyes glowing softly. We've changed everything, she said, her voice a mix of wonder and weight. The Council, the Empire, they'll never be the same. Ragnar pulled her into his arms, his hands rough against her smooth skin. Good, he rasped, his breath warm against her neck. Let him adapt or burn. She laughed, a rare, bright sound, and kissed him deep and slow, a fire that had grown from defiance to something eternal. They sank to the floor, the viewport framing them against the stars, their bodies entwined in a quiet, fierce intimacy. Her coolness met his heat, a balance perfected through blood and battle. And they lay there, the galaxy stretching out before them. "We're not done," Kalia murmured, her head resting on his chest, her fingers tracing a scar from Rigel 7. Ragnar chuckled, his hand at her hair. "Never," he said. "There's always another fight, another fire." He tilted her chin, his gray eyes locking with hers. "You ready to burn the stars with me, princess?" She smiled, a warrior smile, fierce and free. "I've been ready since you crashed into my world," she replied, and her laugh mingled with his, a sound that carried into the night. The door slid shut, sealing them in their sanctuary, but beyond Zethra, the galaxy waited. New threats, new battles, a canvas for their legend. Ragnar Blaze, the human who'd fallen in fire, and Kalia, the princess who'd risen with him, had forged something greater than empires, a legacy of defiance, love, and unbreakable will. The stars bore witness, and in their light, the fire between them burned eternal, a beacon for all who dared to challenge the dark.